At 63, Samuel Carter had exactly 11 days before the bank took the only thing his family had owned for nearly a century, an aging corn farm everyone else believed was already dead. His crops had failed, his savings were gone, and the foreclosure notice hanging on the front gate fluttered in the wind like a final goodbye. Even his own daughter begged him to walk away before he lost everything. But Samuel couldn't. He had made one promise to his late wife, no matter how hard life became. He would never let the Carter family farm disappear. So he kept fighting, even when the odds said he had already lost. Then, just when the auction seemed inevitable, pickup trucks began rolling down the dusty road one after another. The people climbing out weren't relatives, old friends, or wealthy investors. Most were complete strangers. Yet every one of them claimed they had come for the same reason decades ago. Someone named Carter had saved their family, and now it was finally time to repay a debt Samuel never even knew existed. Samuel Carter had spent 43 years believing that if he worked hard enough, rose early enough, and sacrificed enough, the family farm would always find a way to survive. At 63, standing beneath a pale morning sky that stretched endlessly over acres of struggling corn, he wasn't so sure anymore. The stalks should have been tall and thick by midsummer. Instead, many stood no higher than his waist. Their leaves curled from weeks of relentless heat, followed by violent storms that had flattened entire sections of the field. Samuel walked slowly between the rows, brushing rough fingertips across brittle leaves as though apologizing to each plant he couldn't save. His boots sank into patches of dry earth that cracked beneath every step. Farming had never promised certainty, but this year had offered almost none. Weather had become unpredictable. Fertilizer costs had climbed beyond reason. Fuel prices had emptied what little savings he had managed to keep, and every harvest seemed smaller than the one before it. He paused beside an old fence post where generations of Carter men had once leaned while planning another season. His grandfather had survived the Depression. His father had endured floods that nearly washed away everything they owned. Samuel himself had weathered droughts, disease, and markets that treated small family farms like forgotten relics. Yet none of those years had frightened him as much as this one, because this time, it wasn't only the crops that were failing. It was time itself. 11 days remained before the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. 11 days before strangers would legally own land that had carried the Carter name for nearly a century. The thought settled heavily in his chest every morning before sunrise and lingered long after darkness covered the fields. Back at the farmhouse, he rinsed dirt from his hands in the kitchen sink while sunlight filtered through faded curtains Emma had sewn decades earlier. Her favorite coffee mug still rested beside the stove, untouched since the morning she had left for the hospital 6 years ago and never returned. Friends had suggested packing away her belongings. Samuel never could. Leaving them where they belonged somehow made the house feel less empty. The telephone rang just as he poured himself coffee. He recognized his daughter Lily's number before answering. "Dad," she said gently, "did you get the letter?" Samuel stared through the window toward the weathered red barn. "I got it." "Then you know they're serious." "Banks usually are." Silence lingered between them. Lily sighed. "You don't have to keep doing this." "Doing what?" "Trying to save something that's already gone." Samuel closed his eyes. "It isn't gone." "Dad, you've put every dollar you had into that farm. Mom wouldn't want you living like this." Hearing Emma mentioned always hurt more than he expected. "Your mother wanted this farm to stay with the family. She wanted you to be happy too. Samuel looked toward the fields again. Selling isn't the same as saving. Neither is losing everything. Her voice softened. Come live closer to me. You don't have to carry this alone anymore. Samuel smiled sadly, though she couldn't see it. Thank you, sweetheart. She recognized the answer before he spoke another word. You're not changing your mind. Not today. After they hung up, the quiet inside the farmhouse seemed even deeper. Lily meant well. She always had. Life in the city had taught her to solve problems by letting go of what no longer worked. Samuel had spent his entire life believing the opposite. Farms survived because someone refused to quit one season too early. Later that afternoon, he walked to the old machine shed, searching for spare bolts that might keep an aging cultivator running a little longer. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight, pouring between warped wooden boards. Rusted tools hung exactly where he'd left them years earlier. In one corner sat Emma's battered metal toolbox, its faded blue paint chipped from decades of repairs she insisted on helping with, despite Samuel's playful protests that she would lose every wrench she touched. Smiling despite himself, he lifted the heavy lid. Inside lay neatly arranged tools, a pair of worn leather gloves, and beneath them, a folded envelope with his name written across the front in Emma's unmistakable handwriting. His breath caught. Carefully unfolding the paper, he found only one sentence. If you ever feel alone, remember this farm has helped more people than you'll ever know. Samuel read it again, slower this time. He searched the page for more words, another explanation, a date, anything. There was nothing else. He leaned against the workbench, confused. Emma had always spoken with quiet certainty, but he couldn't imagine what she meant. They had sold corn, donated produce to church drives, and helped neighbors when they could, just as farming families often did. Why write this? Why hide it inside an old toolbox? He slipped the note carefully into his shirt pocket, deciding he would think about it later. Evening settled over the farm as long shadows stretched across the fields. Samuel drove his aging pickup toward the front gate after hearing tires crunch over gravel. A county truck pulled away without stopping. Attached to the weathered wooden post beside the entrance was a bright legal notice that fluttered in the warm breeze. He stepped closer, already knowing what it said before reading the bold black letters. Notice of foreclosure. For a long moment, he simply stood there, one hand resting against the gate his father had built decades earlier. Beyond it lay the fields where 4 generations of Carters had planted hope every spring. Inside his shirt pocket, Emma's folded note rested against his heart, while the foreclosure notice swayed silently before him like a countdown that had finally become real. The foreclosure notice remained on the front gate the next morning, its corners snapping softly whenever the breeze crossed the empty road. Samuel could have taken it down. Instead, he left it where it was. Removing the paper wouldn't change the date printed across the bottom. 11 days had become 10. He climbed into his aging combine shortly after sunrise, hoping to salvage whatever corn the storms had spared. The engine protested before finally coughing to life. Every unfamiliar rattle made him wonder whether another repair bill waited just around the corner. Fuel was too expensive to waste, but leaving the crop standing guaranteed even greater losses. He eased the machine into the first row. The yield monitor confirmed what he already feared. Entire stretches produced barely enough grain to justify harvesting them. Samuel shut off the engine after less than an hour and stared across the uneven field. The numbers simply didn't work anymore. A small pickup rolled into the driveway just before noon. Samuel recognized it immediately. Ben climbed out carrying an old backpack nearly as large as himself. At 16, he had grown taller since the previous summer, though his easy smile remained unchanged. "Grandpa." Samuel met him beside the truck and wrapped him in a firm hug. "Thought your mom said you had summer classes." Ben shrugged. "Finished early. I asked if I could help for a few days." Samuel looked toward the farmhouse. "Your mother agreed to this?" Ben smiled carefully. "She said someone needed to make sure you actually ate lunch." Samuel laughed for the first time in days. "Sounds like her." Inside the kitchen, Ben unpacked sandwiches his mother had prepared before sitting across from Samuel. The teenager glanced toward the foreclosure notice visible through the front window. "Mom told me." Samuel nodded quietly. "She worries." "I do too." Samuel reached across the table and squeezed his grandson's shoulder. "I'm still here." "I know." Ben hesitated. "So what needs doing?" That simple question lifted something inside Samuel. They spent the afternoon repairing loose fence boards, clearing fallen branches, and checking irrigation pipes damaged during the storms. Ben worked without complaint, asking practical questions and listening closely whenever Samuel explained why something had been built a certain way. The farm felt a little less lonely with another pair of boots crossing its fields. As the afternoon heat intensified, Samuel suggested they inspect the old grain storage bins behind the machine shed. One hadn't been used in years after newer storage became available. But Samuel wanted to make certain no remaining equipment had been forgotten inside. Rust covered the outside ladder, and the heavy door resisted before finally swinging open with a long groan. Dust filled the air. Sunlight filtered through narrow gaps in the metal walls, revealing shelves stacked with broken tools, empty seed sacks, and weathered wooden crates. "Looks like nobody's been in here forever," Ben said. "Feels that way." They began sorting through the clutter. Most of it belonged in the scrap pile, but Samuel refused to throw away anything without checking it first. Farmers learned early that today's junk often became tomorrow's necessary repair. Ben knelt beside an old wooden cabinet tucked against the back wall. "Grandpa." "Yeah." "What's this?" Samuel walked over. Behind the cabinet sat a narrow compartment, hidden by years of dust and stacked feed bags. Inside rested 3 thick ledgers wrapped carefully in faded cloth. Samuel frowned. "I've never seen those." He lifted the first book gently. The leather cover cracked as he opened it. Every page contained neat handwritten entries stretching back decades. Dates, family names, bushels of seed corn, equipment loans, feed deliveries, tractor repairs. Ben leaned closer. "Looks like farm records." Samuel nodded slowly. "But these aren't ours." Each page listed supplies or services followed by careful notes. Delivered, repaired, loaned, transported. Yet one column remained strangely empty. Payment. "Where are the receipts?" Ben asked. Samuel turned several more pages. "There aren't any." They opened the second ledger. The pattern continued. Different families, different years, more supplies, more equipment. Still no indication anyone had paid. Samuel recognized only a few surnames. Many belonged to people long gone from the county. Others sounded familiar without bringing specific faces to mind. "Maybe Grandpa kept separate accounting books," Ben suggested. Samuel shook his head. "Your great-grandfather balanced every penny. He wouldn't have forgotten collections." Ben traced one finger carefully beneath a faded entry. "Maybe they all paid cash." "Maybe." But Samuel didn't sound convinced. The records covered too many years and too many families. Some entries described expensive machinery repairs or entire wagon loads of seed corn. No struggling farm could simply forget to collect thousands of dollars worth of supplies. Samuel wrapped the ledgers again. "Let's take these inside." After supper, he placed the books across the kitchen table beneath a bright lamp. The handwriting changed slightly after the first volume, suggesting both his father and grandfather had made entries over different decades. Samuel studied familiar signatures until one name surfaced repeatedly in his memory. Margaret Ellis, retired librarian. She had spent years preserving county records and knew local history better than anyone else still living. The next morning, they drove into town carrying the ledgers in a cardboard box. Margaret greeted them warmly inside the small historical room attached to the public library. Her silver hair was tied neatly behind her head, and reading glasses rested low on her nose as she examined the first volume. "Well," she whispered after several minutes, "I haven't seen handwriting like this in years." Samuel leaned forward. "Do you recognize it?" "Your father's, and some pages belong to your grandfather." She carefully turned another page. "These books are probably close to 50 years old." Ben pointed toward the blank payment columns. "Why aren't there any receipts?" Margaret adjusted her glasses. "That's the strange part." She continued reading silently before looking back at Samuel. "These weren't ordinary business records. I've never seen anything quite like them." Samuel felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settle over him again. "Can you tell what they mean?" Margaret closed the ledger gently. "Not yet, but I think someone intentionally preserved these." She paused over one particular page, her expression changing. "This name..." Samuel followed her gaze. Written neatly beside a spring delivery of seed corn was the name of one of the county's most respected businessmen, a man whose successful agricultural company now employed dozens of local residents. Samuel looked at Margaret in disbelief. His family needed help. Margaret slowly nodded without taking her eyes off the page. "That's exactly the question we need to answer." Samuel barely slept after leaving the library. Margaret's words echoed through his thoughts long after darkness settled over the farm. Someone had deliberately preserved those ledgers, and one of the names belonged to the family of the county's most successful agricultural businessman. It made no sense. If his father or grandfather had loaned seed, repaired machinery, and supplied struggling farmers without recording payments, why had Samuel never heard a single story about it? He had spent his entire life working beside his father until the old man passed away. Yet nothing in those years suggested a hidden chapter of the Carter family's history. By sunrise, Samuel had already decided he wasn't going to spend another day wondering. He and Ben loaded the ledgers into the pickup once more before driving toward the first address Margaret had helped identify from the old records. Many of the farms listed no longer belonged to the same families. Some had been sold decades earlier. Others had disappeared beneath larger commercial operations. Their first stop was a modest white farmhouse where 84-year-old Harold Jenkins still lived alone. Harold opened the door cautiously before recognition softened his weathered face. "Samuel Carter," he said with a smile. "Been too long." Samuel shook the old man's hand. "Sorry to come without calling." Harold laughed. "People stopped calling before visiting sometime around 1985. Come on in." The living room carried the quiet warmth of a home that had witnessed generations. Family photographs lined every shelf. Samuel placed one of the ledgers carefully on the coffee table. "I was hoping you might recognize something." Harold adjusted his glasses and slowly opened the book. His smile faded almost immediately. He rested one trembling hand against the page. Well, I haven't seen this handwriting in years. Samuel watched closely. You know it? Your father's... Harold looked up. Where did you find this? Hidden in an old grain bin. Harold continued reading before stopping beside an entry dated nearly 50 years earlier. His eyes grew distant. That spring was terrible. What happened? Harold closed the ledger gently. We lost almost every acre after flooding. Couldn't afford seed for another planting. The bank had already told my father we were finished. Samuel waited quietly. One morning, your father drove onto our farm with a trailer full of seed corn. Harold smiled faintly. Dad told him he couldn't pay. What did my father say? Harold looked toward the window. He said, plant first, worry later. Samuel frowned. Did your family ever repay him? Harold shook his head slowly. He wouldn't let us. There has to be some mistake. No mistake. Harold's voice remained calm. My father tried for years. Every time he brought up the money, your dad changed the subject. Samuel stared at the blank payment column in the ledger. He never told me. Harold smiled sadly. He never told anyone. The answer solved one question while creating another. Why keep helping people in secret? Why never mention it to his own son? After thanking Harold, Samuel and Ben visited two more names from the ledger. One family had moved away decades earlier, but an elderly widow remembered hearing how her father borrowed a tractor from the Carters every harvest for nearly 6 years without ever receiving a bill. Another retired farmer recalled Samuel's grandfather repairing broken equipment late into the night before quietly leaving before sunrise. Each conversation carried the same pattern. Help had arrived when families believed they would lose everything. No payment had ever been demanded. No public recognition had ever followed. During the drive home, Ben stared out the passenger window. Grandpa? Yeah. Did you really not know any of this? Samuel tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Not a word. Why wouldn't Great-Grandpa tell you? Samuel thought for several moments. Maybe he didn't think it mattered. Ben looked unconvinced. Helping that many people seems like it mattered. Samuel couldn't argue. That evening, they returned the ledgers to the kitchen table. Samuel studied the names with new eyes. They no longer looked like unpaid accounts. They looked like quiet acts of generosity scattered across decades. Yet one mystery remained untouched. Emma's note still rested safely in his shirt pocket. This farm has helped more people than you'll ever know. Somehow, she had understood something Samuel himself had never discovered. Ben volunteered to organize several old storage boxes stacked in the upstairs hallway, while Samuel prepared supper. Most contained faded photographs, farm manuals, and tax records. Dust drifted through the hallway as Ben carefully sorted papers into neat piles. Grandpa! Samuel climbed the stairs. Ben knelt beside a narrow cedar chest tucked beneath a window. I found these. Inside rested dozens of envelopes tied together with faded blue ribbon. Every envelope carried Emma's name written in different handwriting. Some had postmarks stretching back 20 years. Others had never been opened. Samuel lifted the bundle gently. Your grandma kept all these. Ben pointed toward the bottom of the chest. There's another one. A single envelope lay beneath the others, sealed separately in heavier paper. Across the front, written in Emma's unmistakable handwriting, were words that made Samuel's heartbeat quicken. Open only if the farm is ever in danger. Neither of them spoke. Samuel held the unopened letter carefully in both hands, staring at the familiar handwriting as though Emma herself had somehow reached across 6 years of silence to place one final message into his hands. Samuel stood silently in the upstairs hallway, the sealed envelope resting in his hands as though it carried more weight than paper ever should. Ben waited beside him without speaking. The words written across the front in Emma's familiar handwriting were simple enough, yet they made the house feel strangely alive again. Open only if the farm is ever in danger. Samuel let out a slow breath. I guess she knew me better than I knew myself. Ben nodded quietly. Are you going to read it? Samuel looked toward the window overlooking the fields. The foreclosure notice still hung at the entrance beyond the gravel drive. Every acre outside carried the same uncertain future. I'd say the farm qualifies. They carried the envelope downstairs and sat at the kitchen table where the ledgers remained stacked beside the coffee pot. Samuel carefully broke the aging seal. Inside was a folded letter and a small photograph of Emma standing beside his parents nearly 20 years earlier, all three smiling during harvest season. He set the photograph aside before unfolding the pages. Emma's handwriting filled both sides in neat, steady lines. Samuel, if you're reading this, then the day we both prayed would never come has finally arrived. I know you'll blame yourself, because that's who you are. But listen to me carefully. This farm was never held together by money alone. Long before I married into this family, your parents taught me something I didn't understand at first. They believed that if someone was hungry, you shared your harvest. If a neighbor couldn't afford seed, you found a way. If someone's tractor broke during planting season, you fixed it before your own. They never kept score because they believed kindness wasn't a debt to collect. It was a crop worth planting. They asked me never to talk about it because helping people wasn't supposed to become a story about them. I honored that promise. But if this farm is ever truly in danger, then you deserve to know something. People remember more than we think they do, even when years pass. Kindness has a way of finding its road home. Don't lose faith in people before they have the chance to surprise you. Love always, Emma. Samuel lowered the pages without speaking. His eyes lingered on the final signature. Ben finally broke the silence. She knew. Samuel nodded slowly. She knew everything. He looked toward the ledgers spread across the table. For the first time, the entries made complete sense. They had never been business records. They were quiet reminders of promises his parents had chosen never to mention. Yet despite Emma's confidence, Samuel struggled to believe forgotten acts from decades ago could possibly stop a foreclosure scheduled only days away. The bank wouldn't accept memories instead of loan payments. That afternoon, Lily arrived unexpectedly. She stepped into the farmhouse carrying grocery bags before immediately noticing the papers covering the kitchen table. "What's all this?" she asked. Ben looked toward Samuel, allowing him to answer. Samuel handed her Emma's letter. Lily read every word in silence. By the time she reached the end, tears had formed in her eyes. She carefully folded the pages and placed them back on the table. "Mom never told me any of this. She promised your grandparents she wouldn't." Lily sat across from her father. "It's beautiful." Samuel smiled sadly. "Beautiful doesn't pay the bank. Neither does refusing reality." The warmth between them faded almost instantly. Lily looked around the aging kitchen, at the worn cabinets, the cracked linoleum floor, and the stack of overdue bills sitting beside the telephone. "Dad, I know what this farm means. I grew up here. But this letter isn't a financial plan. Samuel remained calm. I know. Then why keep fighting? Because your mother believed this place was worth saving. Lily leaned forward. Mom believed in people. She also believed in taking care of you. Samuel looked out the window toward the fields. Selling feels like giving up. No. Lily's voice softened. Sometimes it's accepting that one chapter has ended. Samuel shook his head. Not while I'm still breathing. Neither of them raised their voices, yet the distance between them felt wider than the fields outside. Ben quietly excused himself, sensing the conversation belonged only to father and daughter. He walked toward the equipment shed carrying a toolbox. Without asking anyone, he began replacing broken boards along an old livestock fence before moving to a rusted gate whose hinges had nearly seized. Samuel noticed from the porch sometime later, the teenager worked patiently, sanding metal, tightening bolts, and clearing weeds that had grown around abandoned equipment. He wasn't trying to save the farm by himself. He was simply refusing to let it look forgotten. Seeing Ben work stirred something inside Samuel that he hadn't felt since Emma's passing. Hope remained fragile, but it was no longer completely absent. Late in the afternoon, Lily joined Ben outside. She watched him repaint a weathered mailbox near the driveway. You really think Grandpa can save this place? She asked quietly. Ben kept brushing fresh paint across the faded metal. I don't know. Then why work so hard? Ben smiled without looking up. Because Grandpa is... Lily said nothing more. As evening settled over the farm, Samuel stood inside the barn organizing tools when the distant sound of engines drifted across the fields. At first he assumed traffic from the county road. Then another engine joined the first. And another. Curious. He stepped outside. Dust rose beyond the entrance gate as several pickup trucks turned onto the gravel drive, one after another. Samuel counted 4, then 6, then more. None of the vehicles looked familiar. They rolled slowly toward the farmhouse before stopping in a long line across the yard. Doors opened almost in unison, and men and women Samuel had never seen before stepped out, carrying toolboxes, work gloves, and folded ladders. Samuel exchanged a puzzled glance with Lily before walking toward them, unable to understand why complete strangers had suddenly appeared at the Carter family farm. Samuel stopped a few yards from the first pickup, wiping his hands against his worn jeans without realizing he was doing it. The evening sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as engines fell silent, one by one. Men and women climbed out carrying toolboxes, coils of fencing wire, seed bags, fuel cans, and coolers. None of the faces were familiar. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, a gray-haired man wearing a faded work jacket stepped forward and removed his cap. Mr. Carter? Samuel nodded cautiously. That's me. The man smiled. My name's Robert Hale. My grandfather was Thomas Hale. Samuel searched his memory but found nothing. I'm afraid I don't recognize the name. Robert didn't seem surprised. I didn't expect you would. But your father knew my grandfather. He reached into his truck and removed an old envelope protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. My grandfather kept this until the day he died. Samuel accepted it carefully. Inside was a faded receipt dated more than 40 years earlier. Across the bottom, written in familiar handwriting, were the words, "No payment needed. Help someone else when you can. William Carter." Samuel stared silently at his father's signature. Robert smiled gently. Granddad always said your family gave him enough seed corn to keep our farm alive after a drought nearly wiped us out. Samuel looked up slowly. He told you that? Every harvest. Before Samuel could answer, a woman carrying a toolbox stepped beside Robert. My parents asked me to come. She introduced herself as Denise Morgan. Your grandfather spent 3 days rebuilding my father's tractor during planting season. Samuel looked at her in confusion. I don't remember any of that. Denise laughed softly. You weren't supposed to. Dad said your grandfather wouldn't even let him thank him in public. Another man stepped forward, younger than the others, wearing work boots covered with fresh mud. My family's farm still stands because your parents loaned us equipment one summer. Then another voice joined in. Mine too. Another. My grandmother talked about the Carters every Thanksgiving. Samuel turned slowly from face to face. Every person carried a story. Different years, different hardships, different generations. Yet each one somehow led back to the same farm. Lily stood quietly beside the porch, watching strangers speak about grandparents she barely remembered. She glanced toward the kitchen window where Emma's letter still rested on the table. Samuel cleared his throat. I'm grateful you all came, but... He hesitated. I don't understand why you're here now. Robert answered without hesitation. Because we heard the bank's taking your farm, and because our families never forgot what yours did. Samuel lowered his eyes. That was a long time ago. Robert smiled. Kindness doesn't expire. Before Samuel could respond, another pickup rolled into the yard, pulling a flatbed trailer loaded with lumber. 2 brothers climbed out carrying hammers. Behind them came a small tractor driven by a retired mechanic. Another family unloaded bags of seed corn. Someone else carried replacement hydraulic hoses for aging farm equipment. Within minutes, the quiet yard became a place of steady movement. No one waited for instructions. The mechanic asked where the broken cultivator sat. The brothers walked toward the damaged fencing Ben had started repairing. Denise opened her toolbox beside the machine shed. Samuel raised both hands. Hold on. Nobody needs to do all this. Robert looked at him kindly. Respectfully, Mr. Carter, we disagree. Samuel almost laughed. I can't pay any of you. Nobody asked you to. I don't want charity. Robert shook his head. Neither did my grandfather. Your father helped anyway. Those words silenced every objection Samuel had prepared. Ben watched with wide eyes as volunteers spread across the property. He hurried toward the old barn where 2 men had already begun replacing loose roof panels. Need another pair of hands? He asked. One of them smiled. Always. For the next several hours, the farm changed in ways Samuel had never imagined possible. Rusted gates swung freely after new hinges were installed. Broken fence posts disappeared into neat stacks ready for replacement. An electrician repaired faulty wiring inside the equipment shed. Someone sharpened neglected tools. Others cleaned debris from drainage ditches clogged after the storms. Everywhere Samuel looked, strangers worked as though the Carter farm belonged to them too. Lily walked beside Denise while carrying bottles of water to volunteers. Did your parents really never tell us about any of this? She asked. Denise nodded. They respected your family's wishes. They said helping people wasn't something the Carters ever wanted recognition for. Lily looked across the busy yard toward her father. He honestly had no idea. That's exactly why we came. As sunset approached, several neighbors driving home slowed along the county road. Curious faces watched the growing activity around the farm. Before long, a reporter from the local weekly newspaper arrived after hearing unusual rumors spreading through town. She introduced herself politely before asking Samuel what was happening. Samuel looked around at the volunteers before answering honestly. "I'm still trying to figure that out myself." The reporter spoke briefly with several families, each sharing nearly identical stories of quiet generosity stretching back decades. She scribbled page after page of notes before photographing volunteers repairing equipment beside the old red barn. By evening, nearly every visible corner of the farm looked different. It wasn't restored. There was still too much work ahead. But for the first time since Emma's passing, the property looked alive instead of abandoned. As the final volunteers prepared to leave, Robert walked back toward Samuel. "We'll be here tomorrow morning." Samuel shook his head. "You've already done more than enough." Robert smiled. "We're just getting started." After the last trucks disappeared down the gravel road, Samuel stood beside Lily, watching dust settle behind them. He reached into his pocket and unfolded Emma's note once again. "This farm has helped more people than you'll ever know." For the first time, he finally believed she had been right. The next morning, however, hope met reality. Samuel drove into town for a scheduled meeting with Daniel Brooks at the bank. Daniel listened patiently as Samuel described the unexpected volunteers and the work already underway. When Samuel finished, Daniel folded his hands across the desk, genuine regret showing on his face. "I'm truly happy people are helping you, Mr. Carter." Samuel searched for some sign of encouragement. "Then you'll postpone the foreclosure?" Daniel slowly shook his head. "I'm sorry. I don't have the authority to delay the auction." Samuel left the bank carrying exactly the same weight he had brought through its front doors. Daniel Brooks had spoken with genuine sympathy, but sympathy could not rewrite loan agreements or postpone legal deadlines. As Samuel climbed into his pickup, he looked across the town square toward the grain elevator that had dominated the skyline since his childhood. Businesses opened for another ordinary day, while his own future continued shrinking toward a single date on the calendar. He drove home, expecting the quiet disappointment that had become familiar over the past week. Instead, as he turned onto the gravel road leading to the farm, he slowed in disbelief. More trucks lined the entrance than the day before. A flatbed carrying lumber was parked beside the barn. 2 tractors worked side by side in the fields, cultivating sections Samuel had assumed would remain untouched until next season. Volunteers moved steadily from one task to another, with the calm confidence of people who had already decided they belonged there. Ben spotted him first and jogged toward the pickup. "You're back." Samuel climbed out. "Looks like half the county showed up." Ben grinned. "Almost." Robert Hale walked over carrying a clipboard covered with handwritten notes. "Morning, Mr. Carter?" Samuel shook his hand. "I thought yesterday was enough work for one day." Robert laughed. Apparently nobody else agreed. He pointed toward the equipment shed. Mechanics finished the cultivator. Electricians fixed the wiring. A retired welder repaired your grain trailer before breakfast. Samuel looked around slowly. Everywhere he turned, someone was repairing, cleaning, planting, or organizing. The farm had become a place of purpose again. A woman in her 30s approached, carrying a basket of sandwiches. "Lunch for everyone," she announced cheerfully before introducing herself as Karen Miller. "My grandfather always said, your mother fed him when his family barely had groceries." Samuel smiled awkwardly. "You all keep telling me stories I wish I'd heard years ago." Karen's expression softened. "Maybe they mattered more now." Throughout the morning, new volunteers continued arriving. A retired veterinarian vaccinated livestock without charging a dollar. Two high school agriculture teachers brought students eager to help repair fences. A local trucking company delivered gravel for washed-out sections of the driveway. Nobody asked for recognition. Nobody asked who was in charge. The work simply continued. Samuel spent hours moving from group to group, thanking people who insisted gratitude was unnecessary. For the first time in years, he found himself accepting help instead of searching for reasons to refuse it. Emma's letter returned to his thoughts again. Don't lose faith in people before they have the chance to surprise you. He finally understood what she had hoped he would learn. Inside the farmhouse, Lily had transformed the kitchen table into a temporary workspace. Between helping prepare meals for volunteers, she began interviewing families who stopped by. At first, she intended only to record names and phone numbers so Samuel could thank everyone later. Instead, she discovered story after story stretching across generations. One elderly woman described how Samuel's grandfather quietly delivered feed during a brutal winter without leaving his name. A mechanic recalled his father receiving free repairs after losing nearly everything in a storm. Another family shared a faded photograph showing William Carter standing beside neighbors during a harvest decades earlier. Lily filled page after page with handwritten notes. By afternoon, she realized something remarkable. Nearly every volunteer had heard their story from parents or grandparents. The memories had survived not because anyone kept public records, but because families had passed them from one generation to the next. Margaret Ellis arrived carrying several folders from the county archives. She spread old newspaper clippings across the table. I've been looking through local history all morning. Samuel joined her while Lily and Ben leaned closer. Margaret pointed toward a yellowed article describing relief efforts after a devastating drought decades earlier. Notice anything? Samuel scanned every line. Several local farms received assistance, but his family's name appeared nowhere. Margaret smiled knowingly. Exactly. She opened another clipping covering storm recovery years later. Again, anonymous volunteers repaired equipment and delivered seed throughout the county. No Carter family appeared in the article. Your parents avoided publicity, Margaret explained, but newspaper photographs captured pieces of the story anyway. She produced an enlarged copy of one old photograph. In the background, barely noticeable behind a damaged barn, stood William Carter, unloading sacks from a pickup truck. Another clipping showed Samuel's grandfather repairing a fence while reporters interviewed someone else entirely. They were always there, Ben whispered. Margaret nodded. Helping without needing credit. Samuel rested one hand on the faded newspaper. For years he had believed his family's greatest inheritance was the land beneath his feet. Now he wondered whether something far more valuable had been quietly growing all along. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel noticed himself speaking differently to volunteers. Instead of apologizing for accepting their assistance, he began asking practical questions. Where should fencing materials be stacked? Which field needed attention first? Did anyone require more fuel or water? The shift surprised even him. Pride had kept him isolated for too long. Accepting kindness did not diminish him. It honored the example his parents and Emma had tried to leave behind. Late in the day, another pickup stopped near the farmhouse. A man carrying a professional video camera stepped out beside a woman holding a microphone marked with the logo of a regional television station. Lily looked toward Samuel. Do you know them? Samuel shook his head. The reporter introduced herself politely before extending her hand. Mr. Carter, we've been hearing about what's happening here all day. We'd like to feature your farm on tomorrow evening's broadcast. if you're willing to share your family story." Samuel glanced across the busy yard where strangers continued working together beneath the setting sun, then quietly folded Emma's letter back into his shirt pocket before looking at the reporter. The television crew arrived just after sunrise, while volunteers were already unloading lumber and repairing irrigation lines. Samuel had almost refused the interview the night before. He had never been comfortable speaking about himself, especially when so many people around him had done far more than he deserved. But Robert Hale had placed a hand on his shoulder and quietly said, "This story isn't about you asking for help. It's about showing people what your family spent generations doing for others." Those words stayed with Samuel as cameras were positioned beside the weathered red barn. The reporter began with simple questions about the farm, the failed harvest, and the approaching foreclosure. Samuel answered honestly. He spoke about 4 generations of Carters planting corn on the same land. He admitted he had believed he was completely alone until strangers began arriving one pickup at a time. When asked why they came, Samuel looked toward the volunteers scattered across the property before answering. "I spent my whole life thinking my parents left me a farm. Turns out they left something much bigger, and I didn't even know it existed." The interview ended with Robert, Denise, Karen, and several other volunteers sharing stories passed down through their families. None of them exaggerated. None tried to make the Carters into heroes. They simply described ordinary moments of kindness that had changed desperate seasons decades earlier. That evening, the report aired across the region. Lily, Ben, Samuel, and several volunteers gathered inside the farmhouse to watch on the small television Emma had insisted was perfectly good, despite everyone else buying newer models. The story lasted barely 4 minutes, yet it captured something Samuel hadn't expected. The cameras showed repaired fences, volunteers rebuilding machinery, children carrying water, and elderly farmers standing shoulder to shoulder with young mechanics. The reporter ended with a simple sentence. "Sometimes the greatest harvest isn't measured in bushels, but in the lives quietly changed over generations." Silence filled the living room after the broadcast ended. Then Ben smiled. "Grandma would have liked that." Samuel nodded. "She would have corrected half the things I said." Laughter spread through the room, lightening emotions that had grown heavy over the past week. The following morning, the farmyard filled even earlier than before. Vehicles arrived from neighboring counties carrying people Samuel had never met. Some explained they had watched the broadcast. Others carried faded photographs or old letters mentioning William Carter or Samuel's grandfather. A retired Army veteran introduced himself before unloading fencing supplies. "My parents never forgot your father," he said. "He helped them keep their farm after Dad came home from Vietnam." A young couple arrived with seed purchased from their own savings. "We just wanted to help," they explained. Samuel thanked every person, though the words never seemed large enough. Local restaurants began delivering coffee before sunrise. Church groups prepared lunches for volunteers. A hardware store donated nails, hinges, and paint. What had started with a handful of strangers slowly became a movement that stretched well beyond the county. Reporters returned almost daily, but Samuel politely redirected every interview toward the volunteers and the stories behind their families. One afternoon, a television host asked whether people could send money to save the Carter farm. Samuel answered carefully, "I'm grateful for every kind thought, but we're not asking anyone for charity." The interviewer looked surprised. Samuel continued, "If people want to help a neighbor, volunteer somewhere, repair a fence for someone who can't. That's what my parents believed." The interview spread quickly online. Instead of envelopes filled with cash, offers of practical assistance began arriving. Farmers pledged equipment during planting season. Mechanics volunteered repair work. Seed companies offered discounted supplies. Retired agronomists promised advice for future crops. Samuel accepted those offers because they strengthened the farm rather than simply delaying another problem. Lily watched everything change with growing amazement. She spent hours recording interviews with volunteers, organizing old photographs Margaret discovered, and matching names from the ledgers to the families now arriving at the farm. Each connection confirmed the same pattern. Quiet generosity had traveled across generations without anyone expecting repayment. One evening, she joined Samuel on the porch as the last volunteers headed home. "I owe you an apology," she said softly. Samuel looked toward her. "For what?" "I thought this farm was only land." She glanced across the fields. "I didn't understand what was really growing here." Samuel smiled gently. "Neither did I." They sat together without speaking for several minutes, while Ben locked the machine shed after another long day of work. For the first time in years, father and daughter shared hope instead of disagreement. Across town, Daniel Brooks watched the evening news replay the Carter story in the bank's break room after most employees had gone home. He recognized many of the families speaking on camera. Several were respected business owners with excellent financial records. Others operated successful farms that had once stood on the edge of failure. Daniel remembered Samuel sitting across his desk only days earlier, quietly accepting that the foreclosure process would continue. Now the entire community seemed determined to stand behind him. Daniel rubbed his forehead. He understood the bank's policies. Contracts existed for a reason. Yet watching hundreds of people work together to save one family farm made the situation feel less like numbers on a balance sheet and more like something far more human. The next morning, he reviewed Samuel's loan file again before closing it with a thoughtful expression. Back at the farm, volunteers gathered for another day of work when Robert Hale's phone rang. He stepped away to answer before walking quickly toward Samuel, a mixture of surprise and relief visible on his face. "Mr. Carter," he said, holding up the phone, "the bank just confirmed someone made a payment against your loan this morning." Samuel frowned. "Who?" Robert slowly shook his head. "They wouldn't say." Samuel stared toward the farmhouse, unable to imagine who could have done such a thing. The payment wasn't enough to erase the debt, but it was substantial enough to change the numbers in ways he hadn't expected. Somewhere, someone had quietly stepped forward without asking for recognition, just as William Carter once had. The news of the anonymous payment spread across the farm before sunrise, but no one could explain where it had come from. Robert had confirmed only that a substantial amount had been applied directly to Samuel's overdue loan. The bank refused to identify the donor, honoring the person's request for privacy. Samuel stood quietly beside the front gate, staring at the foreclosure notice still fastened to the weathered post. The paper remained there despite the unexpected payment. Whatever hope the gift had created, it had not erased the deadline. Auction day was still approaching. Volunteers arrived as they had every morning during the past week, greeting one another like neighbors who had worked together for years. Some asked Samuel if he knew who had made the payment. He answered honestly each time, "I don't." Robert smiled. Maybe that's exactly how the person wanted it. Samuel folded Emma's letter inside his shirt pocket once again. Anonymous kindness. It sounded painfully familiar. His father had done the same thing all his life, without leaving his name behind. Whoever had stepped forward now seemed to understand that lesson as well. Ben spent the morning cleaning the loft above the old machine shed, where decades of forgotten boxes remained stacked beneath thick layers of dust. Samuel joined him after finishing repairs to an irrigation pump. Together, they sorted faded feed catalogs, broken lanterns, and cracked wooden crates that had not been opened in years. Most held little more than rusted hardware or worn farm journals, already too damaged to read. Then Ben noticed a narrow wooden box wedged behind a support beam. "Grandpa," he called, brushing away dust, "there's something back here." Samuel climbed the ladder carefully. The box was heavier than it looked, and secured with a simple leather strap that had nearly crumbled with age. Inside rested another handwritten journal, smaller than the ledgers but protected carefully in waxed cloth. The first page bore a date from the early 1930s and the unmistakable signature of Samuel's grandfather, Joseph Carter. Samuel sat down on an overturned bucket and began reading, while Ben leaned over his shoulder. The entries described years Samuel had only heard about in history books. Crops failed repeatedly during the Great Depression. Banks foreclosed on neighboring farms. Families packed belongings into wagons and disappeared almost overnight. Joseph wrote plainly, never complaining about his own hardships. Instead, he recorded decisions that Samuel had never imagined. One entry stopped him cold. "Today I signed papers placing our south field against the bank so the Wilson family could keep their farm another season. Sarah worried we might lose everything. I told her land is only valuable if good people still live beside it." Samuel reread the sentence twice before turning the page. Another entry mentioned helping a different family purchase seed after selling two of the Carter family's strongest horses. Another described repairing equipment for widows whose husbands never returned from war. None of the pages expressed regret. Every sacrifice appeared matter-of-fact, as though Joseph believed no explanation was necessary. Ben remained unusually quiet until Samuel closed the journal. "He risked losing his own farm." Samuel nodded slowly. "More than once." "Why?" Samuel looked across the open doorway toward fields that had carried his family's name for generations. "Because he believed neighbors mattered more than acres." Ben smiled thoughtfully. "Kindness has been growing here longer than the corn." Samuel looked at his grandson with quiet surprise. The teenager's words captured everything the journals, ledgers, and Emma's letter had been trying to teach him. This land had produced harvests every autumn, but the greatest crop had never been stored in grain bins. It had been planted inside people. That afternoon, Margaret visited again to examine the newly discovered journal. She carefully turned each page before closing the cover with deep respect. "This belongs in a museum someday," she said. Samuel smiled gently. "I'd rather keep it here." "I understand." Margaret looked around the farmhouse. "Your grandfather documented something historians often miss." "What's that?" "Communities survive because ordinary people quietly choose one another over themselves." Samuel rested his hand on the journal. He never expected anyone to read this. "Probably not," Margaret smiled. "Sometimes the most important history was never written for the public." Outside, volunteers continued preparing the fields as though another season already waited beyond the crisis. Fresh fence posts stood where broken ones had leaned only days earlier. Machinery once destined for the scrap pile now hummed steadily after countless donated repairs. Children played beneath the shade trees while parents stacked lumber and organized tools. The farm no longer looked like a place preparing to disappear. It looked like one preparing to begin again. Yet practical reality remained stubborn. Late that afternoon, Samuel received another call from Daniel Brooks. The anonymous payment had reduced the outstanding balance, but not enough. The remaining debt was still significant, and without another solution, the foreclosure auction would proceed as scheduled. Daniel spoke gently, clearly wishing he had better news. Samuel thanked him anyway before ending the call. He stood alone on the porch for several minutes, watching the volunteers finish another day's work. Hope had transformed the farm. But hope alone could not satisfy legal documents already moving through the system. Lily joined him carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Bad news." Samuel nodded. The payment helped. He paused. "Just not enough." Lily looked toward the volunteers laughing together near the barn. "Whatever happens, you're not alone anymore." Samuel smiled faintly. "No. I'm finally starting to believe that." As evening settled across the fields, the last trucks slowly pulled away until only the Carter family remained. Ben locked the equipment shed before stopping beside the front gate. He glanced at the foreclosure notice still fluttering in the warm breeze. "How many days now?" he asked quietly. Samuel looked toward the county road where tomorrow would bring whatever it chose. "None," he answered. "Tomorrow is auction day." Samuel woke before dawn, though he had barely slept. The farmhouse was silent except for the steady ticking of the old kitchen clock that had hung on the wall since his parents were newly married. He poured himself coffee and stood by the window overlooking the fields. The rows of corn stretched into the morning mist, still imperfect, still scarred by storms, yet standing. Emma's letter rested neatly folded inside his shirt pocket beside the small photograph she had hidden with it. He touched both gently before stepping onto the porch. The air carried the cool promise of another summer morning. But today felt unlike every other day the farm had known. Today, strangers could legally become owners of the Carter family's land. Ben joined him a few minutes later without saying a word. Together, they walked to the front gate where the foreclosure notice still fluttered softly. Samuel reached out, removed the paper from the post, folded it carefully, and placed it inside his jacket. "Figured it didn't belong hanging there anymore," he said quietly. Ben nodded. "Whatever happens, this is still home." By 7 o'clock, pickup trucks began arriving once again. Samuel assumed volunteers had come for another workday until Robert Hale stepped from his truck wearing a clean button-down shirt instead of work clothes. Denise Morgan arrived dressed similarly. Karen Miller followed. Then the retired mechanic, the veteran, the teachers, and dozens of familiar faces. No one carried toolboxes. No one unloaded lumber. They simply gathered near the farmhouse. Samuel looked around in confusion. "What's going on?" Robert smiled gently. "We're going with you." Samuel shook his head. "There's nothing you can do at the courthouse." "Maybe not," Robert replied. "But you shouldn't walk in alone." Within minutes, a long line of vehicles formed behind Samuel's aging pickup as they headed toward town. Along the drive, more trucks joined the procession from side roads. Farmers, business owners, church members, and families whose names Samuel barely knew fell quietly into line. Nobody honked. Nobody made speeches. They simply drove together. When Samuel reached the courthouse square, he stopped in disbelief. Dozens of additional people were already waiting outside the entrance. Some held faded photographs. Others carried worn envelopes or journals passed down through their families. Reporters stood nearby with cameras, surprised by the growing crowd. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere remained calm but noticeably different from ordinary auction mornings. Daniel Brooks stood near the front of the room, reviewing paperwork. When he looked up and saw the number of people entering behind Samuel, his expression changed. He had expected a routine foreclosure proceeding. Instead, nearly every bench slowly filled with members of the community. Samuel quietly took a seat beside Lily and Ben. Robert sat directly behind them. Denise, Karen, Margaret Ellis, and dozens of others settled into the remaining seats until standing room became scarce. The auction official reviewed the legal documents before beginning the scheduled proceedings. Just as he prepared to continue, Robert stood. "Excuse me, sir." The room turned toward him. "May members of the public speak?" The official hesitated before looking toward Daniel. Daniel answered carefully. "Brief statements may be entered into the record." Robert nodded gratefully. He stepped forward carrying the faded receipt Samuel had seen days earlier. "My grandfather kept this his entire life." He held it carefully for everyone to see. "When my family's farm was dying after a drought, William Carter gave us seed and refused payment. He wrote one sentence." Robert read the familiar words aloud. "No payment needed. Help someone else when you can." He looked toward Samuel. "Everything my family has today started because of that decision." Robert returned to his seat. Then Denise stood. She described Samuel's grandfather rebuilding her father's tractor without charging a penny during planting season. A retired veteran spoke next, recalling how William Carter quietly helped his parents while his father recovered after returning from war. Karen shared her grandparents' story. An elderly woman unfolded a faded letter thanking the Carter family for delivering food during a brutal winter. One by one, families rose. Some spoke for only a minute. Others struggled through tears. Every story echoed the same truth. The Carter family had never asked for recognition. They had simply helped people when those people needed it most. Samuel sat motionless, overwhelmed by voices telling pieces of a history he had never known. Lily reached for his hand. He squeezed hers gently without taking his eyes from the speakers. Margaret Ellis finally stepped forward, carrying one of the original ledgers and Joseph Carter's journal. "These documents confirm what we've heard today," she said calmly. "For generations, this family quietly invested in people instead of expecting repayment. Today's gathering is not charity. It is history returning home." Silence settled across the room after she finished. Even the reporters had lowered their cameras. Daniel Brooks looked slowly around the packed courtroom before lowering his gaze to Samuel's loan file. The numbers remained unchanged. The contracts remained valid. Yet nothing about the situation felt ordinary anymore. He stood and addressed the auction official. "Given the new information presented today, and the significant community involvement surrounding this property," he said carefully, "I'd like to formally request a final review of the loan before the foreclosure proceeds." A quiet murmur spread through the room. The official frowned slightly. "Do you believe such a review is warranted?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, I do." The official consulted several documents before finally closing the file in front of him. "The foreclosure auction will be temporarily paused pending that review." Relief swept across the courtroom, but only for a moment. Samuel looked toward Daniel. Paused. Daniel met his eyes honestly. Not canceled. The room remained silent as everyone realized the truth. The farm had gained time, but its future was still uncertain. The courthouse emptied slowly, but no one rushed home. Families gathered on the steps, talking quietly beneath the shade of old oak trees while reporters packed away cameras. Samuel stood near his pickup with Lily and Ben, unsure whether to feel relieved or exhausted. The foreclosure had been paused, yet the future of the farm still depended on decisions far beyond his control. Daniel Brooks approached, carrying a slim folder beneath one arm. "Mr. Carter?" he said. Samuel turned toward him. "I appreciate what you did in there." Daniel shook his head. "I requested time. The decision still belongs to the bank." Samuel nodded. "I understand." Daniel hesitated before continuing. "There are people at headquarters who watched the news coverage. They've asked for every document connected to your case, including the updated loan balance, the anonymous payment, and the community support being offered." Samuel looked surprised. "Does that help?" "It means they're looking beyond the numbers." That was all Daniel could honestly promise. 3 days followed with agonizing slowness. Volunteers continued working at the farm even though no one knew what the final decision would be. Samuel tried returning to ordinary routines, repairing equipment, checking fields, and helping wherever another pair of hands was needed. Yet every few hours he found himself glancing toward the telephone inside the farmhouse. Ben remained beside him through nearly every task. One afternoon, they walked the edge of the cornfield where green leaves had begun recovering after careful irrigation and countless hours of work. "Looks healthier," Ben observed. Samuel smiled. "It does." Ben bent down, scooping a handful of soil into his palm before letting it fall between his fingers. "You know what I've been thinking?" "What's that?" "Everyone keeps saying people saved this farm." Samuel looked across the fields. "Didn't they?" Ben smiled. "I think your family spent generations planting this harvest. It just took a long time to grow." Samuel laughed quietly. "You're getting wiser than your grandfather." Ben shrugged. "Grandma would have said the same thing." Samuel felt the familiar ache of missing Emma, but this time it carried gratitude instead of loneliness. Her letter had guided him when he needed it most. Without it, he might have pushed every volunteer away before anyone had the chance to help. On the 4th morning after the courthouse hearing, the telephone finally rang. Samuel answered before the second ring. "Samuel Carter speaking." Daniel's calm voice came through the receiver. "Mr. Carter, could you come to the bank this morning?" Samuel's heartbeat quickened. "Should I be worried?" Daniel paused just long enough to make waiting impossible. "I'd rather tell you in person." Less than an hour later, Samuel, Lily, and Ben walked together into Daniel's office. The bank manager stood as they entered. A folder rested neatly on his desk. He motioned for them to sit before taking a slow breath. "Headquarters completed its review late yesterday." Samuel remained silent. Daniel opened the folder. "They considered your payment history over many years, the recent anonymous contribution toward the loan, the practical support pledged by local businesses and neighboring farms, and the long-term sustainability plan several members of the agricultural community submitted on your behalf." Lily looked confused. "What sustainability plan?" Daniel smiled faintly. "The volunteers didn't only repair fences." He slid several papers across the desk. "They organized equipment sharing agreements, seasonal labor commitments, crop support, and transportation partnerships. They demonstrated that this farm has a realistic path forward." Samuel stared at the documents, recognizing signatures from Robert, Denise, Karen, local business owners, mechanics, teachers, and neighboring farmers. While he had been worrying about losing everything, others had quietly built a future around him. Daniel closed the folder. "Because of those commitments, the bank has approved a complete restructuring of your loan instead of foreclosure." For several seconds, no one moved. Samuel blinked slowly, certain he had misunderstood. "You're saying—" Daniel smiled for the first time since they had met. "You're keeping your farm." Lily covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Ben let out a joyful laugh before wrapping both arms around his grandfather. Samuel lowered his head, overwhelmed by relief too deep for words. After a long moment, he looked toward Daniel. "Thank you." Daniel shook his head gently. "Thank the people who reminded all of us that communities are investments too." Word spread through town before Samuel even reached home. As his pickup turned onto the gravel road, dozens of vehicles already lined both sides of the driveway. Volunteers, neighbors, families, and children waited beside the barn. The moment Samuel stepped out, applause rolled across the farmyard. Robert Hale walked forward first. "Well?" Samuel looked around at every familiar face before smiling through tears. "We're staying." Cheers erupted. Hats flew into the air. Children laughed as neighbors embraced one another. Denise hugged Lily. Karen wiped tears from her own eyes. Even Margaret Ellis stood quietly near the porch, smiling as though she had been waiting years to witness this moment. Samuel climbed onto the old wooden wagon his father had once used during harvest so everyone could see him. He removed Emma's folded letter from his pocket and held it carefully. "I spent weeks trying to figure out how to thank all of you," he began. The crowd grew silent. Then I realized something. None of you came because you expected thanks. You came because somebody named Carter once helped your family without asking for anything in return. He looked across the gathering. "Truth is, I didn't save this farm. Neither did one miracle or one anonymous payment. My parents planted kindness. My grandparents planted kindness. Emma believed in it. And all of you brought the harvest home." No one applauded immediately. Many simply stood, wiping tears from their faces. Robert finally spoke. "Your family taught us how." A week later, beneath a bright blue sky, Samuel carried a small bag of seed corn toward the first prepared row. Beside him walked Ben, eager to learn every step, while Lily adjusted her work gloves after announcing she had decided to move back home permanently. "The city will survive without me," she had laughed. "This place shouldn't have to." Volunteers gathered nearby, not because they were needed anymore, but because they wanted to witness a new beginning. Together, they lowered seeds into the fresh soil. Samuel paused halfway down the row and looked across the fields stretching toward the horizon. They still demanded hard work. They still carried risk. Farming had never promised certainty. But for the first time in years, the future no longer belonged to fear. Later that afternoon, Ben helped Samuel install a carved wooden sign beside the entrance gate where the foreclosure notice had once hung. The words burned into the polished oak read, "Carter Family Farm, where kindness was always the first harvest." Samuel stepped back, studying the sign while the evening breeze moved gently through the young corn. Emma's note remained folded safely in his pocket. "If you ever feel alone, remember, this farm has helped more people than you'll ever know." He finally understood. The greatest inheritance waiting on this land had never been measured in acres, buildings, or harvests. It had been quietly planted in hearts across generations, growing unseen until the day an old farmer needed it most. And when that season finally arrived, kindness returned home like rain after a long drought, saving not only a family farm, but the man who had almost forgotten what hope looked like. Years later, Visitors driving through the county would often slow down when they passed the old Carter family farm. They would see healthy rows of corn stretching toward the horizon, a freshly painted red barn, and a simple wooden sign at the entrance that read, "Where kindness was always the first harvest." Most never knew how close that land had come to disappearing forever. They only knew the stories their parents and grandparents had told them, stories about a family who never asked whether helping someone would be profitable, only whether it was the right thing to do. Samuel often stood on the porch at sunset, watching Ben walk the fields that one day would become his responsibility. Lily had brought laughter back into the farmhouse, filling empty rooms with family dinners, shared memories, and plans for seasons yet to come. Emma's letter remained tucked safely inside the same old toolbox where she had hidden it years before, no longer as a message for a desperate husband, but as a reminder for every generation that followed. Samuel finally understood what his wife had wanted him to learn. A farm is never saved by soil alone. It is saved by the people whose lives have been touched by what grows there. Corn may feed a family for a season, but kindness can feed generations. Looking across the fields one final time, Samuel smiled, knowing that long after the harvest was gathered and the machinery fell silent, the greatest crop the Carter family had ever planted would continue growing in the hearts of people they had once helped, people who, when the time came, returned that kindness home. And perhaps that is the truest measure of a life well lived. Not what we leave behind for ourselves, but what we quietly plant in others, trusting that one day, when hope seems lost, it will bloom again.